So again, good evening, everybody. I'm Rebecca McLean, Executive Director at the Oneida County History Center. We are very excited this evening to have Ashley Hopkins Benton, the Senior Historian and Curator of Social History from the New York State Museum. Tonight, of course, you are here because she's going to be discussing the life of Henry DiSpirito, something that she started researching for her master's thesis while in graduate school. So we're very excited to learn a little bit more. So with that, I'm going to pass over the microphone, and the screen to Ashley.
Hello, everyone. I'm just going to get my slides going here. I'm so glad that you're all here joining me. And as I said early as we joined on, I'm sad not to be with you in person, but I love that we can get together from all over the state and all over the country this way. So this is a joy for me as well. So I thought I'd start out by telling you just a little bit about how I got to, quote, know Henry DiSpirito. Unfortunately, he did pass away before I had the chance to meet him. But while I was a student at the Cooperstown graduate program, his family had donated his papers, in addition to a number of sculptures, to the Fenimore Art Museum. And the papers had just arrived in the archives, and my professors thankfully said, "We think you might be a good person to take a look at these. Please take a look and see if they'll work for a thesis for you." And I dove in before they were even processed, and I got to meet his family and instantly fell in love with his work and his story and his family as well. I'm glad they are my friends today. So I've been working on this for over 13 years. It's a collection that has then followed me to the New York State Museum as well. And I'm glad to say that we now have a collection of works in the New York State Museum's collection because of the family, and that we have an exhibit on view at the New York State Museum. So when we open back up again, I hope that you'll come join us to see that as well. So Henry DiSpirito was an immigrant artist. He came from Castelforte, Italy, and his works are inspired both by his birthplace and the things he witnessed as a young boy, and then of his adopted home in Utica, New York. His works reached a national art audience and also to many diverse local audiences in central New York. So we'll talk about all of those this evening. Bear with me, I'm having just a bit of an issue with changing my slides. There we go. So Henry DiSpirito is most known for his carvings in stone. He worked in a method called direct carving. And in this, he started with a piece of stone and he carved away material to reveal a figure. This is different from modeling, where a sculptor might take clay and build something out of it. And it's even different than a lot of the marble sculptures that we're so used to, the classical and neoclassical sculptures in museums, which were often conceived of in clay first and then transferred into stone. Henry DiSpirito looked at the stone itself, saw what was inside, and revealed it through his work. And this direct carving tradition was really established in the United States in the 1920s. And he was one of several artists who were working in this method. So just to put DiSpirito's work into context, I wanted to show you a couple examples from Robert Laurent, who was also an immigrant artist. He came here from France. And you can see that he worked in both stone and wood, just as we'll see Henry DiSpirito did. William Zorak, again, also an immigrant artist from Lithuania. And John Flanagan. And I think that Flanagan probably has the most in common with DiSpirito. Like DiSpirito, he liked to work in fieldstone, or stones that he found out in nature, rather than purchasing or acquiring stones in other ways. There is no evidence that Henry DiSpirito ever met any of these men or saw their works in person, but certainly you can see how he fits into this style that was really growing at the time that he started working this way. we'll go back to the beginning a little bit. Henry DiSpirito was born in 1898 in Castelforte, Italy. He was born as Erasmo DiSpirito. He changed his name once he arrived in the US. He left his formal education in the 4th grade to become an apprentice to his father, who was a stonemason. And as a young man, he longed to be an artist, but he felt a duty to his family that he needed to learn a trade and to earn money. And you can see one of his works here from later in his life, the water carrier, which is in the New York State Museum collection. But this is inspired by his memories of his hometown, and particularly his mother and the other women from the village as they went to get water. DiSpirito was given a chance to exhibit the paintings that he worked on in his free time at a local hotel by hotel and restaurant owner Antonio Coletta. His works were seen by a gentleman named Carmine Fusco, who's a visiting painter. And Fusco invited him to apprentice with him to actually learn painting, which he took up as an opportunity. And he moved to a different village in Italy for a time. When World War I hit, DiSpirito was called into service. He served in an office position, and he was greatly impacted by the pain and suffering that he saw that the war impacted his country and his countrymen. You can see that in his works from throughout his career. On the left, we have The Pain of War, a piece that he did in clay. And you can see the anguish on this figure's face, a memory that he had of wartime. And then on the right is After the Battle from 1947. And this is a piece in granite that's in the collection of the Fenimore Art Museum. DiSpirito said that after the battle, no one wins. And he much later in life was quoted, "Art is for humanity, not just for the few on this earth. If instead of a gun or toy soldiers, every child were given a brush, molding clay, or a sculptor's tool, this would be a happier world, the kind of world it was intended to be." So you can see his value on beauty and good in the world over war. When he came out of the military service in October of 1920, he looked for ways to leave Italy and to come to the United States. And on March 18th, 1921, he left on the Duca d'Aosta to join his uncle and cousin in Utica. And he arrived on April 1st, 1921. As I said, he was renamed Henry when he arrived, something that his daughters didn't know until much later in life. When he arrived in New York, he was put on a train. Like many immigrants who did not speak English, his destination was pinned to him. And he got off in Utica and was very excited, overjoyed to see the Union Station in Utica and to see the Carrara marble there. Then he stepped out onto the streets of Utica and saw that they were indeed not paved. They were still dirt. Most of the buildings were made out of wood, and his heart sunk. So this idea of the American dream for him, suddenly his dreams were being crushed. He had a long way to go to appreciate his hometown. This is a painting from 1940 that he did of the Mohawk Valley. So you can see that he did come to very much appreciate this adopted hometown. DiSpirito began night school classes to learn English. Education was very important to him, even though he only completed his formal education up to 4th grade. He was a lifelong learner. The library was especially important to him, and he continued to go and learn new things throughout his life. In 1930, he became a citizen, and he began all sorts of work around the Utica area. Although he was trained as a stonemason, it was difficult initially to find work because of the union system. So he worked in various other places. He worked in a cotton mill, he worked as a house painter, and eventually he was able to get work as a bricklayer, as you can see here in this wonderful photo by Dante Tranquille. He worked on buildings and structures and institutions that would later show his work. So he worked on buildings at Hamilton College, Colgate University, and even the wall and the parking lot of the Munson William Proctor Art Institute, which I'll talk about a little later. Much later in his life, he wrote an application for a fellowship, trying to get money so that he could devote more time to his art rather than this hard labor as a stonemason bricklayer. And in the application, he wrote, "The fellowship would relieve me of the necessity of working at my trade as a bricklayer and stonemason, and would provide me with a sustained period of direct contact with nature in the form of both subject and material. Since the start of my career as an artist, my work has been done after working hours on Sundays and holidays. Time has literally been stolen in which to do this work, as I had to fulfill my obligations as husband and father. It is my belief that now is the peak of my creative period, and I need full time to devote to sculpture. Not only would I use the time to create, but also to make extensive studies into animal and insect life." On the right, you can see a drawing that he did of my working shoes in the collection of the New York State Museum. So you get that connection between his art life and his working life, and some of his subject matter. And on the left is a painting of Proctor, or a drawing in pastel of Proctor Park in Utica, another one of the places where he worked as a stonemason as well. DiSpirito made a home in Utica. He met Rose Conti, and the couple married on June 11th, 1927, and they had 3 daughters who we are grateful to have here with us this evening. They began their lives as a family in a flat at 729 J Street, and later in a house at 1008 Glendyna Street. And you can see on the right a view out the window of the apartment, looking into the industry that was nearby where many of his neighbors were employed. And here another view of that industry in the Mohawk Valley. I think this painting is particularly interesting because, again, it shows this industry that his neighbors, his immigrant neighbors, were working in, and beyond that, the nature that he enjoyed being in so much, and all encapsulated in this artwork. He lived kind of a double life in a way, in that he was in this immigrant community, he was friends with his neighbors, but they were not involved in the art that he loved so dearly. So there was a bit of a disconnect there as well. In 1940, DiSpirito found work on a WPA art project that was under the direction of E.N. Clark. He was invited by his friend George Cook, and together they built 8 dioramas with beeswax figures on wooden armatures to tell the history of the Mohawk Valley and of the Utica area. These dioramas are currently in the collection of the Children's Museum in Utica, but in the process of being shifted to other homes. This project was really important for DiSpirito because it expanded his horizons beyond 2-dimensional artwork. It got him thinking about sculpture. And he was so grateful that he later went on to sculpt E.N. Clark, the leader of the project. And you can see that plaster bust on the right. That piece was also in the collection of the Children's Museum, but is now headed to the History Center. So will be part of their collection. Because 3-dimensional artwork was new to DiSpirito, he decided that, and again, he needed more information, he needed to learn more, and so he enrolled in classes at the Munson William Proctor Art Institute from 1941 to 1943. There he met Richard Davis, who, when Davis learned that Henry DiSpirito was trained as a stonemason, he encouraged him to try direct carving, to try his hand at looking at a piece of stone and revealing the sculpture that was within it, with tools that he was very familiar with already. Later in life, a review of one of his exhibits by the Utica Observer-Dispatch noted that Henry DiSpirito, a Utica sculptor, is an unusual combination of artist and craftsman. A stonemason by occupation, he has a technical skill acquired over many years of handling the tools of his trade, which combines with a genuine depth and power of artistic conception to produce an intensely personal and valid expression. Perhaps the outstanding feature of DiSpirito's work is the sense of genuine and honest respect for his material, a gift which he shares with such great sculptors as Michelangelo. So very high praise and comparison there but certainly the viewers of his work can see how well he knows that stone and how well he communicates with it. DiSpirito's relationship with Davis would continue after he studied at the Munson William Proctor Art Institute. They often corresponded about sculpture and exhibitions. Davis advised him later, now about exhibiting, I would say this: if you can afford it, exhibit as much as possible. My reasons are that showing your work and seeing your work in exhibitions with other sculptors, you will grow and improve and get valuable criticism. And indeed, DiSpirito took him up on that advice. But before we get to that, I just wanted to show this piece from the New York State Museum collection, because I think it's a fantastic example of seeing the form emerge from the stone and the way that he revealed just enough information to see this form of the elephant. And I should say DiSpirito also carved in wood. I mentioned this briefly when we mentioned John Flanagan, but wood was a media that he used as well, particularly these kinds of found pieces of driftwood and kind of more knurled wood, as you see here. DiSpirito also met a champion named Paul Coonrat of his work. Coonrat purchased one of DiSpirito's works from an exhibit at the Munson William Proctor Art Institute in 1952. And because Coonrat traveled a lot for his work, he offered himself as an agent for free to DiSpirito to help spread the word about his artworks. He wrote, "I want you to know that I am proud to be your friend and equally proud to be a friend to your cobblestones, who are alive as you to me and a part of you. What little I am doing to introduce these friends to the world of art is not work. How could it be? Really, it is joyous and thrilling each time I present them, as I feel the warmth and immediate response that comes from their new friends." So Coonrat was able to, when he was in New York City or in other places during his travels, go to gallery directors and museum directors and be a person to show off these photographs of DiSpirito's work. And he really helped him get a foothold into many exhibition spaces. The Munson William Proctor Art Institute continued to be very important to DiSpirito's career. He first exhibited there while he was a student. His second show there was in 1947 at the 10th annual exhibition of works by artists of Utica and Central New York. This was a juried exhibition, and as they did in many juried exhibitions held there at this point, they decided to purchase Leaping Frog for the permanent collection, and it is still in the collection there today. You can see that this is a really wonderfully dynamic piece showing the motion and the liveliness of the animal. In 1950, at the 13th annual exhibition, he was chosen as one of 3 artists deserving of a one-man show and showed there later. And as I mentioned, he worked on the stone wall of the Munson William Proctor Art Institute as a stonemason, but he did leave a small carving there as well. And you can see it in the parking lot to this day. The Cooperstown Art Association was also a really important connection for DiSpirito throughout his career. In 1947, this work, The Snail, was accepted by the jury for their annual exhibition and awarded first place in sculpture. And this was really uplifting to him. It meant a lot. It meant that his work was accepted and appreciated. The Utica Observer Dispatch noted that it was, quote, typical of Henry DiSpirito's use of animal subjects to express an intense concern with the basic values of humanity. He had works accepted in almost every annual exhibition from 1997 through 1985. And this really shows his dedication. Even when his works began being shown in larger institutions, especially in New York City, he continued to focus on these institutions across central New York as well. After tirelessly promoting his work with the help of Coonrat through photos and letters of introduction, DiSpirito broke out into the New York City art world in 1950 and 1951 with invitations to exhibit at 3 institutions. After the battle seen here, was requested in February 1950 for exhibition at the SculptureCenter in New York City. And that actually started a very long relationship that DiSpirito had there. His works were kept at the SculptureCenter. It was a place that people in New York City could go to see them on a pretty consistent basis until 1983. The director there, Dorothea Denslow, was also a really important, encouraging force for him. And she in particular was one who encouraged him to apply for grants to be able to focus more of his efforts on his artwork and not have to do so much work as a stonemason as well. Here is the Ant from 1952. This was accepted into a show at the National Academy of Design in 1984 when DiSpirito was 84 years old. The SculptureCenter had this piece on long-term exhibit for many years, and they helped out by delivering it to the National Academy of Design. Here we have Lizard in the collection of the High Museum of Art in Atlanta. This was invited to be sent for exhibition at the Whitney Museum in 1950 at their annual exhibition of contemporary American sculpture, watercolor, and drawings. That is a quite selective, nationally focused art show, so another really big accomplishment. And in 1951, the Patient Donkey of 1950 was also exhibited at the Whitney. And then in 1953, Bang the Moon. And 1956, Birds of the Night. And you can really see in all of these, again, his ability to find those creatures in the stones that he went out and found and show their character, their personality, and their motion. In 1951, DiSpirito was invited to exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art in their New Talent exhibition, along with Irving Kreisberg and Raymond August Mintz. And he sent several works, including the ram, the cannibal, the bee, the toad, the grasshopper, and the squirrel. And from that group, he sold almost half of them. This was a really important exhibition for him because it was when the Rockefellers discovered him. So from that MoMA exhibition, David Rockefeller purchased the grasshopper and Nelson purchased Cannibal, and they would continue to be his patrons for several years afterwards. By 1957, Nelson also owned the ram, the bee, rabbit number 3, the sacred scarab, toad number 3, and crickets. And there was a lot of correspondence back and forth between them. When DiSpirito was exhibiting in other exhibits where he thought one of the pieces they owned was a good fit, he would often request to borrow it and be able to exhibit it again. And because they wanted the work to stand on its own, they didn't want it to stand because it was in their collection. They often lent it, not listed as the owners, as an anonymous lender. In a 1957 letter to Nelson Rockefeller, DiSpirito wrote, "Your generous support of the arts is an asset to American culture. The tradition of the de Medici family is carried on." Sales of DiSpirito's works did not make enough for him to quit working as a stonemason, despite his tireless work in creating sculptures and during the evenings and on weekends and promoting them. So he applied for several grants in an attempt to have more time to be able to work as an artist. In 1954 and 57, he applied to the Guggenheim Fellowship Program and unfortunately was unsuccessful in both of those. But in 1956, he applied to the National Institute of Arts and Letters and it exhibited in a show of grant applicants' work. His pieces included nesting birds, the lobster, and the skunk. And he was chosen for this grant. He was exhibited again as an exhibit of artists that were chosen. And what I find particularly interesting about that group and that application year is in the same year that he was accepted, both Willem de Kooning and David Smith were rejected. So those are certainly names that we're more familiar with today. And that's a big feat on his part. Upstate New York was still very important to him, as I mentioned, in central New York. So museums and galleries in upstate New York were places that he exhibited regularly. In Albany, at the Albany Institute, he had a two-man show with painter Edward Christiana, also from Utica. He exhibited at the Berkshire Art Association in a show that was juried by Norman Rockwell. He won an award for that exhibition and had the chance to meet Norman Rockwell. He also exhibited regularly at the Memorial Art Gallery in Rochester, at the Syracuse Museum of Fine Arts, at the Robertson Memorial Art Center in Binghamton, and at the Everson Museum in Syracuse. And not only did he participate in their fine arts exhibitions and frequently in juried shows there, but he also participated in lending and sales galleries. This is not something that we're used to in art museums so much today, but through the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, many of these institutions had the ability to sign out artworks, much like you would sign out a book from the library. Certainly not their whole collection, but a small curated collection of works. So DiSpirito's works were often included in these lending galleries. He wanted them to be accessible. He wanted people that couldn't afford to buy a sculpture still have the opportunity to live with art in their life. And so that was very important to him. He also, in his correspondence, you can see him loaning works personally to a lot of people that just wrote to him and asked. And he felt that that was important as well. So I'd also like to talk about some of his studio spaces because he had several that were important to him during his time working in Utica. And they tell a lot about the importance of home to him, of Utica as his community, and of the importance of his neighbors and the people around him as well. For a number of years, DiSpirito held an outdoor exhibition in his studio spaces, and he wrote, "It was April of 1921, after leaving my native land, that I arrived in Utica, and from then on the city has been my home. The people, the industrial atmosphere, the scenic surroundings, and everything else pleased me greatly. The only things lacking for me were an art museum and an art school. In 1936, through the generosity of the Munson William Proctor Arts Institute, a new cultural program began. It was a new life for the artists of the community, and I am proud to say that I have taken part in all of the regional and local exhibitions. In presenting my 10th annual outdoor exhibition to the general public, I pay a modest tribute to my country of adoption and to my community." So in the first space that the DiSpiritos lived in their apartment on J Street, he worked outside in a side yard on a tree as his table. And he would later talk about the importance of conversations between sculptor and neighbor and sculptor and children. The J Street studio was just down the street from the Brandigi Elementary School. And often as school was getting out for the day, he would ask the children their opinion on the works that he was working on. He said that children would tell him what they thought the rocks looked like and that they don't lie. And later in his life, school programs were still very important for him. He went into schools to speak to children about the arts, about what he did as an artist and why art was important in their lives as well. In the late 1940s, DiSpirito was able to move to a studio in a garage on Jefferson Avenue. This was easier for year-round work, not as weather dependent as his outside setup. This was acquired through Alfred Landolfini, who was from a village near Castelforte. So this really shows the strong connections in the Italian community of East Utica. And this photo is actually from one of the annual exhibitions at the garage, a space where he both worked on his sculpture and exhibited it between 1950 and 1959. In 1958, the family moved to a house on Blandina Street, and he lived there until the end of his life. And there he had a studio in the basement for working nights and during inclement weather. But he also used the outdoor space, and his backyard became his garden for both working and display of his sculptures, and a place to observe nature as well. Henry's Garden, as it became known, was a place where friends, patrons, museums, and gallery staff were all invited. He rarely traveled to openings that were outside of Utica. He did not go to the openings in New York City. or further afield, but visitors were always invited to his home. And he felt that they got a complete experience there. They got to see the works in natural light, see them in a setting that was perhaps similar to the places that you would see some of these animals. And they got to meet the artist, of course, as well. In 1963, DiSpirito was awarded an artist in residency program at Utica College of Syracuse University by Dean Ralph F. Sturble. And that residency was renewed every year until his death in 1995. This was life-changing because it was a steady paycheck for him and allowed him to retire as a stonemason and focus on his art. And it was also important to him to be around people and to be around youth, especially. Edmund Wilson, in his book Upstate, commented, "We went to see Henry DiSpirito. I thought he was perceptibly changed. I think it has meant a lot to him to have his appointment and studio at Utica College so that he does not have to work at bricklaying anymore. He is having 2 exhibitions this summer and he has won a prize at Cooperstown. He does not have to pretend to be humble. His face seems even more remarkable than his shock of snow-white hair, more expressive in its enthusiasm and humor. It is as if his stony physique had become with greater freedom more flexible. His wife says that he has lately had a great burst of work. After 60, he is prodigiously productive." So the studio at Utica College became the place where he worked, and the garden was the place for displaying his work, and many guests were invited to both places. On the importance of a studio not connected to the home, DiSpirito said, and I think this is so poignant today as so many of us work from home so often, he said, "This is the place that tells you to do what you're here for, not for enjoyment, but you are here to create new things. When I come here, it is something different. I leave the house. The house is a place where you sleep, but when I come here, it is a place where I work to produce new things." So as I mentioned, this was an opportunity for him not only to step out of the home and have a place focused on work, but a place to be around young people. He did not teach formal classes at the college, but he invited students to drop in to watch him work. And for students that were willing to accept criticism and willing to learn, he was happy to take them under his wing. He developed close relationships with many students and faculty, all the way up to the president of the college, and sculpted portraits of many of them. The very landscape of Utica College to this day is changed by DiSpirito's work, both in the 10 works that he donated, but also the 4 commissions that he made, and in works that the families have donated later on. They remind students of the heritage and the community of the college. In 1963, he was commissioned to create the Pioneer, his largest piece on campus, by Dean Sturble and F. Clark Laurie, the business manager. The Pioneer was the symbol of the school, but DiSpirito, perhaps especially as an immigrant, had difficulty imagining how the idea of the Pioneer connected with the pioneer that we think of in the American West. And he said, "I tried to put him in a buckskin and coonskin cap, rifle in his hands, but I couldn't do it. I had no feeling for him that way. I saw the Pioneer as a universal symbol as well as the symbol of Utica College, and that's the way I had to make him. I told the late Dean Sturble a man could be a pioneer in art, in culture, in knowledge, or as he was, a pioneer in education. I found a large fieldstone that was as rugged and strong as I wanted my Pioneer to be. I worked on it outside because when I finished it, that was where it would stand. I tried to keep it simple and make only suggestions of detail." So here on the right, we see the finished work as it stands at Utica College to this day. It has pink granite from the Adirondacks as the primary stone and a boulder found by DiSpirito near Syracuse as the base. And on the left-hand side is actually a study, a portrait of Mac, which was a study for the face of the Pioneer. And you can see that it's not an exact portrait in the finished work, but he certainly takes some strengths out of his face to develop that piece. In 1959, the class of 1959 commissioned a memorial to Dean Sterble, the Book of Knowledge. And this again shows the importance that DiSpirito placed on learning and throughout his life, and how much he looked up to people at the college who fought for continuing learning and education. The class of 1970 commissioned him to create a work for the new Harold T. Clark Jr. Athletic Center. And this piece, the athlete was also carved outdoors, as you can see in the picture on the right. The log was placed on the ground outside of the library, and students at the college assisted with the process. As I mentioned earlier, DiSpirito did do direct carving in wood throughout his career, but as he got later in life, especially during his time at Utica College, wood appears more and more in his repertoire. And of course, it would be easier to carve than stone. In 1971, DiSpirito found a boulder during construction of buildings on campus, and in it he saw a tiger. So he requested permission to use it and began carving the tiger, as you see here. The stone was moved to a site near the dorms on the college where it was more visible. And as the students saw it, some requested that perhaps it could be considered a panther. The administration asked him to stop soon afterwards. This was during the time of the Black Panthers. They were worried this could be controversial, and they asked him to just kind of quietly set it aside. He stopped work immediately. He refused to comment on the piece, but he visited it often, and it made him very sad to not be able to finish this work. The happy part of the story is that in 1986, he remarked that he wished they would move it near the library, and ultimately they did. And that's where it stands today. I included two pieces related to wind here. On the right is Dodging the Wind, which he carved in 1982 out of applewood. He thought of it as a tribute to Utica College students. He said, "It was a thing that I see every day. I would look out the window and see students carrying their books, and I was very sympathetic with them because of how the students struggled to get to school, fight the wind to get their education." And then on the left is Girl in the Wind. So the wind is a theme that appears in his work multiple times as well. I've mentioned again and again that DiSpirito felt such importance for the idea of education and continued learning. And he did a number of pieces throughout his career on learned people that he looked up to in his life. So in this case, this was Asa Gray, carved in made in 1971 out of cast stone. And this was a person that he read about. And said he was a lifelong fan of the library, so he studied Asa Gray and his science work. He also created a sculpture of James Dwight Dana, the geologist, which was also gifted to Utica College. In 1987, DiSpirito had a retrospective exhibition at the Edith Barrett Art Gallery on campus. And it was not just an exhibit, but also a video project documenting his life and work. And both were projects of students studying many different disciplines, including art, public relations, and gerontology. And the exhibit itself broke attendance records. So it was a really cross-disciplinary project that was very popular at the college. In 1989, DiSpirito was honored with a honorary doctorate from Syracuse University. And this, of course, was a major achievement to him as well. A man who, as we've said, finished his formal education in the 4th grade, but looked so highly upon those who continued their education and continued to study. To be honored in that way was very, very important. Beyond the college, DiSpirito was very much involved in the Utica community and various organizations in the surrounding area, be it for loans of his work or lectures that he did for special occasions. And he did also do some commissions. In 1970, he created this cast stone piece called the Volunteer Fireman for the Deerfield Volunteer Fire Company. And while they wanted to pay for this, they considered it a commission. He said that because they were volunteer firemen, he wanted to be a volunteer sculptor, so he did it for free. DiSpirito was also very actively involved through the years in the blind and visually impaired communities. One way in which this started was through a contact with the Rehabilitation Center for the Blind in Topeka, Kansas. They approached DiSpirito about buying a piece. They had seen his work. They felt that it would be wonderfully tactile and a good way to introduce art to those who are blind and visually impaired. He sent a sculpture of a rabbit with the stipulation that it must be returned if it didn't meet their needs. Besides the sheer enjoyment of the object through manual observation of it, all of us, the sighted and the blind, continue to wonder about the man who can see inside rocks, what kind of a person he is, and what does he tell us through his art. That was the letter that they sent back accepting the sculpture. His sculpture was also included in the work Beauty for the Sighted and the Blind in 1959, which was a guidebook for using objects for instruction in the visual arts for those who were blind and visually impaired. In 1962, he exhibited at the home of Josh Billings in Brandor, Pennsylvania. This was an outdoor exhibition on his sprawling property, but the exhibition was geared towards children and the blind. They were encouraged to come see the sculptures in the outdoors and to touch them and to experience them physically as well as visually. In 1982, he participated in A Touch of Sculpture, a show for the sighted and blind at the Kirkland Art Center in Clinton, New York, along with his daughter, Teresa. They both exhibited their sculptures there. And then in 1992, he exhibited at the Central Association for the Blind and Visually Impaired in Utica in a joint project with the Herkimer Community College Art Gallery. Again, it was a hands-on exhibit, and it was also designed to be educational. So there were programs with it where there were blindfolds and special glasses for the sighted who were visiting the exhibition to experience it as a person who was visually impaired might experience it. Eugene Nasser, writing on Henry DiSpirito and other individuals in Utica who inspired the children of working class families, said, Henry's example was the most telling of them all, the immigrant stonemason with his toolbox who, after a life of work much like that of our fathers, turned late in life to the call of his soul to art. So as you've seen, DiSpirito never lost his love and appreciation and the importance that he placed on art through his whole life, with his focus on his family and his career that provided for that family. He kept laser focus on his art as well, and to the point of creating this wonderful collection that we see across numerous museums, thanks to the family as well. I just want to close with this slide. On the right, you can see a cover of the book, Breathing Life into Stone, which is published by the Fenimore Art Museum, which includes my writing on DiSpirito, but also his memoirs. So you can read about his life through his own words, and also the writing of his daughter, Teresa. I will also, if we have any educators in the audience or anyone who works with children, the New York State Museum has just completed lesson plans which are available on our website, and I encourage you to check those out as well. They heavily make use of his memoirs and his own writings to help students learn about being an immigrant in the early 20th century and also about direct carving. So that brings me to the end. I'm happy to take questions if we have questions.